So I thought I'd start, since we do have about an hour to have this discussion, looking back a little bit, bring us up to speed. What has happened on the legislative front that's relevant to access to pre-approval medicines over the last few years? Want to start, Holly?
Sure. Well, I was going to talk a bit about Act for ALS, but we heard a lot about that already today. So happy to, to continue that discussion during the Q&A. In terms of, we can talk about some of the legislative proposals that are kicking around, but, in terms of what actually has been passed through Congress, I think the most important change outside the expanded access space, but relevant to access, is some changes to FDA's authority around the accelerated approval pathway. So in the end of 2022, Congress passed an Omnibus Reconciliation Act that has been dubbed FDORA. It has to do with spending, towards FDA, but had some specific legislative changes that were intended to tighten how the expanded access, gosh, I can't speak today, the accelerated approval pathway is used. And it was really in direct response to controversies around aducanumab for Alzheimer's disease, which kind of revealed to the broader public, I think, some concerns about this, this compromise between early access to drugs before we're totally confident that they work, with the promise that we'll gather additional confirmatory evidence about them later. So one of the most important changes in FDORA was giving FDA the authority to require that confirmatory studies be underway prior to the grant of accelerated approval. This is something that FDA had already started doing, but Congress basically said, yes, we agree that you have the authority to do this. There was some kind of wrangling about whether it was going to be a may require or a must require, some concern that if FDA insisted on having those confirmatory studies already well underway prior to granting accelerated approval, that would be especially difficult in certain disease areas, especially in the rare disease context. We heard that concern come up quite a bit. But FDA itself has released data indicating that when the confirmatory study is already well underway prior to the grant of accelerated approval, we can move much more quickly either to the transition to full FDA approval or to withdrawing the indication. So you just move things along much more quickly for obvious reasons, right? If you already have the study underway, you're not going to be facing some of those challenges with enrolling a study from scratch, after the product is already available on the market. So that was one of the big changes in FDORA, even though it wasn't quite a change in terms of what FDA was already doing. And then there were a couple of other things in that legislation that were intended to kind of give FDA greater information about how those confirmatory studies were progressing. So more frequent reporting so that FDA can intervene. And then the last thing I'm kind of on the fence about, which is one of the concerns is that it's difficult for FDA to withdraw products after they've received accelerated approval, and they either are lagging in getting their confirmatory studies done, or the confirmatory studies actually fail to truly confirm benefit. It can be difficult for FDA to withdraw the products. So there's now some change to the withdrawal process, which we can get into more detail about this, but it's not clear to me that the withdrawals will be any easier, nor that they will be any faster, because the process has some new kind of procedural elements that have been added to it that I can imagine will actually make things go a bit more slowly. So I should stop there. There's other things that have happened, but FDORA, I would say, is probably the biggest.
What would you add, Karin, on this looking backwards question? What's already been done that we need to know about?
So I think in addition to what Holly talked about, some of the other changes we've seen at FDA as well as on the legislative front over the last couple of years go again towards trying to speed up time to market and trying to really make it easier to bring products into the hands of the patients as quickly as possible. And the way I think of them is in kind of a couple of different buckets. The first is around decentralized trials. I think during COVID, we've really seen how telehealth, how more decentralization using digital health technologies, et cetera, has really been instrumental for many in our community who have a hard time traveling and who might otherwise not be able to participate in a clinical trial. And we've really seen FDA put a lot of emphasis into trying to incentivize and create more regulatory certainty and guidance around decentralized trials. Again, trying to make sure that as many patients as possible can benefit from investigational therapies within the confines of a clinical trial. Similarly, we've seen a lot of emphasis on making it easier to interactions between the drug sponsors and FDA. Again, learning from some of the experiences during the pandemic. So for instance, the START program, which I think is closing the first application cycle next month, is really trying to make it easier to have some of that interaction with the regulatory agency to...
You should tell people what the START program is. Yeah.
It's what used to be the Operation Warp Speed for rare diseases. So really trying to make sure that there is a dedicated person to reach out to at FDA for regulatory questions, to really program manage and project manage the interactions better, and really trying to streamline the whole process to, again, make the development of the clinical trial protocols and all the way, all the path to market as fast and as easy as possible. Some of the other concerns that we continue to see are around what are some other ways to try to speed up the path to market, understanding that expanded access, as we have talked about today, it can be a wonderful tool, but there are lots of logistical challenges with it. And so, for instance, there is a GAO report right now that is trying to look at what are all the different opportunities beyond expanded access to improve rare disease drug development. There's a National Academy study that is looking at regulatory approval processes in the EU versus the US, and some of the provisional approval pathways that exist in Europe, and what from those learnings could be brought into the US context. So there's a lot going on right now in Congress, and I'm happy to dive deeper.
And Zach, I promise not to make you go last every time, but I know that you have a few things to add to the list of legislative accomplishments.
Yeah, well, I guess on Fedora, the only thing that I would add is I think since it's been enacted, we've seen a few examples of companies that have come out publicly and said, yes, the FDA did require us to be, if not fully enrolled, like significantly enrolled in our confirmatory trial. So I think that's been positive. And I would say, I think ODAC has met several times to take a look at some of the dangling accelerated approvals, and that has kind of sped the process up a little bit because, then outside experts in the advisory committee can basically tell the sponsor some of what the FDA has probably told the sponsor as well. So I think that's proven to be helpful. And, I guess beyond all of this, we've seen, right to try, which I'm sure you guys have spoken a lot about, and kind of its limited success so far. I think the report from September said there were only like 12 cases of treatments being used under right to try, if that's correct. But we've also seen things like the creation of ARPA-H, and I think, that can really kind of dig in on, some of the innovative fronts that, maybe NIH or, some other funded research from the government won't dig into. So we'll see what comes of all that.
Acronym you used for the group that met and looked at the dangling approvals, ODEP?
ODAC, yeah, sorry,
ODAC?
that's the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee.
and ARPA-H, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, built after DARPA and IARPA in the Defense and Intelligence agencies. So we have this new mechanism for funding cutting-edge research. Well, thank you.
Exactly.
Anything follow-ups on those that have already been, things that have already happened in Congress or FDA? If
I'll just add, I mean, on ARPA-H, I think it's a really important model, and it's the thing that I hope Congress will focus on, which is giving money for research rather than legislating around approval standards. I think we are more likely to get better drugs if we focus on the science than if we focus on kind of tweaking what's allowed to get past FDA.
And any views on why ARPA-H is more exciting than just putting more money in regular NIH lines? Does anybody have a thought on?
I didn't mean to suggest it was. I'm just like more money for research, but yeah, if you want to add more on ARPA.
Absolutely. So I completely agree. We need more funding for research at every part of the government. We know NCATS has been at NIH has been a really big supporter of clinical research and early rare disease research. I think what makes ARPA-H a little special is that they're really trying to dream big. So fail fast, take really big risks that are not that are likely to not work, but if they work, they can revolutionize how we think about rare diseases, how we think about health. And I think there is the need to have some funding for these types of broad, bold research initiatives. But yes, I absolutely agree. From where I sit, I'm very worried about the flat funding and the funding cuts that we know are plaguing many parts of government research right now. And we know so many of our rare disease treatments have started with NIH funding.
Well, I mean, just to reflect back on this conversation we've had for the last 10 minutes, I mean, it's easy to think of Congress as completely dysfunctional, or it's easy to think that we were here 2 years ago and had all the same conversations, but a lot's actually happening on this front, not necessarily, you know, a whole new access pathway or something, but I think you've listed a lot of at least contextual changes to this environment, which are really interesting. So let's look at what you think is most promising on the legislative agenda, bills that have been proposed, or some of the most interesting reforms that are currently being debated. Can I start with you, Zach? Or Zachary? Zach.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the major health committees in the Senate and the House right now are pretty well focused on PBMs and drug prices. So a lot of the legislation related to clinical trials and expanded access, I guess, aren't necessary. Well, you know, we'll see. We'll never know. But you know, some of the bills that I've seen come out recently that I thought were interesting. There was a bipartisan bill introduced in the House, I think it was last week, on making clinical trial participant payments tax-free income, so that people, you know, to further encourage people to participate in clinical trials. I think they think that that could increase diversity. There was another bill that was introduced not too long ago that would penalize companies that don't conduct timely pediatric studies. I think that's another key area that the FDA has raised questions about, that some companies kind of, they win their approval and, you know, as part of their post-market duties, they have to run a pediatric trial, and sometimes they, you know, drag their feet on it, or they don't conduct it at all. So I think that could really be, you know, some new teeth that the FDA could show. There was one other one that's pending that I can't think of right now. Anyways, come back to me. I'll remember it. But
Yeah,
those
there's some chance that your other two panelists will hit it.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Karin.
Piggybacking on pediatric research, we know that the vast majority of rare diseases start in childhood, affect children, and we know that there's a depth of data around safe dosing, and so this has been a long-standing priority for us at NORD. One of the bills that is not new, but that is about to expire in September, and that is a big concern for us, is the Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program. It's really a way to incentivize research into pediatric rare diseases. So those rare diseases that that are not just rare and affect children, but really have very serious health impacts or fatal in childhood. And we know that those are the most difficult to research. And so what the Pediatric Review Voucher Program does is to provide a voucher for expedited review for a second drug, which the drug company can use for a second drug or can sell. And it's really a way to attract funding and to have a revenue stream, in particular for smaller biotech companies. We know there have been a number of really groundbreaking pediatric drugs that have been developed in large parts thanks to this program. And if this program were to cease to exist in September, that would be, I think, a big concern from our perspective. There's a companion program for medical countermeasures, and that program did lapse. So there is some precedent in Congress that there is a world in which this program is not timely reauthorized. We know that can have tremendous impact on FDA. Last time when the program was about to be reauthorized and there were some questions around timing, we know we saw a huge uptick in the drug sponsors trying to get in the designations before the program expired. So there was a huge uptick in workload, which again is not great for anyone. And again, we are very worried about that program expiring.
Holly?
Well, I just want to flag this idea of a program expiring, because this is a trend in how FDA legislation often works, right? So like we have user fee reauthorizations every couple of years. We have a lot of pieces of legislation that industry and patient groups start to rely on, and then they have to go to bat for it every couple of years. And I'm torn about it, right? Because in some ways it's good to bring those things back up again, right? The user fees, there's a lot that we could worry about when it comes to user fees, but one benefit is that every 5 years, there's an opportunity for the agency to come before Congress basically and have some new things kind of get added to their authority. It can be used for good and evil, right, in terms of what ultimately how the agency's authorities get shaped. But it's just an interesting challenge that I think faces FDA and its programs, is that they're very often authorized as, appropriations that need to be re-upped every few years, and that can create some instability in the system. Just jumping on what Zach had said about the tax-free clinical trial participation payments, it's like something that absolutely should have been done already. If we want to encourage people to participate in research, this would be a way to make the money that they're offered go farther. And one of the reasons that it's important, Zach raised the point about equity. For low-income people who get other government benefits, there is the risk that the payments that you get to participate in research can actually make you ineligible for some of the other government benefits that you receive. And it just seems like a very silly thing that we would be taxing those payments for something that's so socially valuable. This is, we now have kind of transitioned to what's on the legislative docket, but we didn't talk in your first question about the Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously is on a lot of people's minds, in terms of the potential impact on innovation, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act, one piece of it is that Medicare will be able to negotiate a limited number of drug prices with an expanded number of drugs up for negotiation as time progresses. And it's after, these drugs have been on the market for quite a long period of time, able to generate revenue. The idea is that Medicare will be able to pick those that are most costly to Medicare and negotiate with the companies to pay a fair price. Whether the Inflation Reduction Act will in fact reduce innovation is something that there's just loads of empirical research and loads of just claims, right? You know, pharma saying one thing, academics like me are saying something else based on data. But one thing that's in front of Congress, right, is this discussion about whether there was adequate exemption for orphan drugs. So if you have an orphan drug designation from FDA, then you are exempted from eligibility for negotiation within the Inflation Reduction Act. But as soon as you get another indication approved, whether it's another orphan indication or an indication for a larger population disease, then you would become eligible for negotiation of price. There's been a lot of consternation. I would love your opinion about this, but there's been a lot of consternation about that, whether the orphan drug exemption should be expanded. You can understand the arguments, right? You know, look, if it's orphan designation, maybe all orphan designations should be, or indications should be exempted from price negotiation. On the other hand, Aaron Kesselheim's group published a paper recently indicating that actually these orphan drugs do cost the government quite a bit of money. And, you know, his group was arguing maybe none of them should be exempted in the first place. And so as we kind of roll out the Inflation Reduction Act and see how it's going to play out in practice and see which lobbying organizations are most effective, I think there could be some movement in the orphan drug space about price negotiation.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. Just to provide maybe a little bit of a finer point on this, one of our biggest concerns with the orphan drug exemption right now is that it's not just when there's an approval for a second disease that the product loses its exclusion from price negotiation. It's really as soon as there's a second designation. So designations are really early drug development incentives. They provide opportunities to receive some tax credits, to not have to pay the FDA user fees. They make a product eligible to apply for certain orphan drug grants at FDA, but it's not a marketable product. It's not an approved product yet. We're still in the pre-approval space. And so from our perspective, penalizing a drug company for seeking that second orphan drug designation is really concerning. In that Kesselheim paper, which you reference, the authors actually explicitly assumed that if there was a drug that had one often approved indication and multiple designations, that all the other designations would be withdrawn, which de facto means that those research programs would probably be killed. And I think that is, from our perspective, a big concern. 70+% of orphan drugs right now are only approved to treat one rare disease. And we know that having that multiple serial innovation to find whether the drug works for more than one related disease is really important with more than 7,000 rare diseases. And so our first priority right now is to see if we can fix that. So there are larger conversations to be had about what is the right size of the orphan drug exclusion. But from our perspective, pipeline decisions are made right now. And we don't want these research programs to be killed now because the law really penalizes wanting to research a drug for a new disease.
Zach, do you want to get into this conversation on the orphan drug designation or the what we're calling the Inflation Reduction Act? If not, I have a different theme to pick up, but I want to sure you get a chance.
Yeah, and let me just say quickly that the PRV program being reauthorized was the other piece of legislation that I was thinking of, the medical countermeasures one that hasn't gotten in there yet. And that, along with PEPFAR, is another big one that was not reauthorized this year, but needed to be. But yeah, I mean, I think what I've heard from industry, and particularly Genentech's former CEO, was kind of making the case that, you know, with this exemption, or with only one exemption for an orphan indication in place, you know, we might forego research on a smaller population and go just wait for a larger indication in order to start research on, which I think, you know, the Portal gentleman rightly kind of refuted by saying that, you know, if you have a blockbuster on your hands, the odds that you're going to wait, you know, some undetermined amount of time to go for a larger indication probably isn't something that's going to happen in reality. But you know, to the former Genentech CEO's point, like, I mean, I think that is true, is that if it is that clear that one indication is going to bring in, you know, much bigger windfall than several smaller ones or one smaller one, there is a chance that, you know, the company could just go after that one indication if they, but again, I think we have to talk a little bit about, like, you know, how bad the industry is at prognosticating, you know, what are going to be blockbusters 10 years from now. And I think that's you know, everyone wants to say, you know, this drug in our pipeline and that drug in our pipeline is going to bring in tens of billions in the future. But, you know, we're not very good. We, as in, like, everyone who watches drug pricing, I think, is not very good at, you know, kind of making those predictions further than a few years down the line.
Chime in, there's one other component of the Inflation Reduction Act that I think is quite germane to a lot of the conversations we've had over the last 2 days. And that's really about how do you measure value? But as CMS is creating the initial offer, they have to look at, on an indication by indication basis, what is the unmet need that is addressed by that drug? What are the therapeutic alternatives? And what is the fair value of that therapy? We know, in particular for orphan drugs, there's not a lot of data out there. So one of the things that we've been really asking CMS to do from the beginning is to hold patient listening sessions, patient and provider listening sessions, to collect some of that data and some of that information. CMS did this for the first year, which was commendable, understanding it was a lot of work on a very short timeline. We've had a number of conversations since. There probably are some ways in which to make that process work better and more meaningful going forward. But I think for everybody here in the room who is working in that pre-approval space, as these drugs come up in future years, think through what really are the ways to engage patients and providers. What is the meaningful data to capture what is the value of these products? How can we actually think about therapeutic alternatives for some of on an indication by indication basis? And to what extent might data from expanded access programs and other data that may not necessarily be easily accessible for CMS might be a valuable data point to the conversation we had over lunch today around expanded access data potentially helping with coverage and reimbursement decisions.
Well, I thought I'd go back to a theme that Zach originally brought up and Holly commented on, is this idea of the taxability of payments to clinical trial participants. And Zach, I think you brought that up as a pending legislative fix that's being considered. And then Holly sort of broadened the consideration to, like, well, what about not just taxability, but thresholds for, I guess, primarily Medicaid eligibility, I would assume, but other forms of public benefits. Does anyone know if that legislation has tried to fix the issue Holly raised as well? Because it strikes me as actually a much larger disincentive than the taxability issue. Does anyone know if that's in the legislation, if that's been considered?
I said, I don't know.
Zach, do you happen to know about that since you brought up the bill in the first place?
I don't. Sorry. Say your question again. I didn't quite get it.
It's about that issue you raised originally, that payments to clinical trial patients, to subjects in clinical trials, are taxable currently. And I think you said that there's legislation on being considered to make it non-taxable. And then Holly commented that potentially an even bigger problem is that these payments could put someone over an income threshold for Medicaid or other public benefits. I just wanted to see if you knew if that's been raised in the same legislation.
Yeah, so they say in the legislation that they would exempt these clinical trial payments from your gross income. Does that make more sense?
At least for taxing. So hopefully that would apply to other eligibility, although some of those thresholds are actually set by state law, as Medicaid in the strange American fashion is this delegated program, mostly federal money, but administered by the states. So I think that's a really interesting open question for someone to pursue.
And maybe related to that, other policy proposals that go in the same direction are, for instance, allowing sick days to be used for trial participation, in particular for caregivers. We know the logistics of participating in a clinical trial, in particular for caregivers, can be really challenging, and not being able to use sick days in order to cover trial participation can be one of those barriers that seems just ripe for legislative fix. And I know there have been proposals.
I imagine that could also be done with the Department of Labor rulemaking. It would be my guess. I don't know, but it's not my area. So let's look at the legislative agenda with our worrying hats on. Is there anything coming through Congress that you think is rather scary from the perspective of access to drugs? Any bad ideas that are percolating? Want to start, Holly?
I thought you'd never ask, Chris. Yes, there are some worrying things happening right now. One, you all can chime in on this one and others, but the one that I'm most worried about is a bill that's called Promising Pathway Act. It's been kicking around for several years now. It was originally called the Conditional Approval Act. It's being advanced by Senator Braun and has actually picked up a fair bit of bipartisan support over the past couple of months. And it is the part of the reason why it's so worrisome is that it looks really good on its face. And when you start to peel back the layers and realize what the implications could be, then you get worried about it. So what the Promising Pathway Act proposes to do is create a new provisional approval pathway, ostensibly, inspired by some of the pathways that we see in Europe. And so the proposal is that if a product has relevant early evidence of a promising therapeutic benefit, it would be eligible for provisional approval. It's similar kind of eligibility criteria for accelerated approval. You have to have a serious or life-threatening disease or condition that the drug would be intended to treat. It's not limited to rare disease, right? It's any serious or life-threatening disease or condition. And so you would then get this provisional approval in 2-year increments up to a total of 8 years. That's quite a different standard for approval than the traditional FDA approval standard, which is substantial evidence of effectiveness, right? Relevant early evidence of a promising therapeutic benefit. Those terms are not defined in the bill. There's reference to early stage clinical investigations. So very clearly would be intended to allow provisional approval on the basis of phase 2 studies, which FDA already does sometimes, could allow provisional approval on the basis of even earlier evidence, right? What counts as promising, right, evidence or positive therapeutic benefit, lots of things, right? So that's my worry as a lawyer, right, is that if you read those words, they could be very wide ranging. The safeguard kind of built in is, it's only 2 years. And, if the drug is not progressing through clinical development to actually confirm benefit, then those 2 years would automatically, you'd automatically have the provisional approval expire.
We know a lot of professors have called for flipping the default rule, right?
Flipping the default rule, right? However, I think it's going to be pretty unlikely that it would actually be an on-off switch like that. And in contrast to accelerated approval, where on paper you get your early approval and then you do your confirmatory study in some reasonable period of time, the way the bill is currently worded, what happens after provisional approval is that there would be a mandatory observational registry. So if you get one of these provisionally approved drugs as a patient, you would be required to be in this registry. And then there's really a lot of fuzziness about whether those observational registry data would be what is used to transition to traditional FDA approval. Why am I worried about that? Registry data, right? It's not randomized, it's not blinded, it's not controlled. Now, I don't mean to suggest that RCTs are the only way of knowing, but especially in diseases where you have heterogeneous disease progression, heterogeneous patient populations, you really do need to have this level of control and blinding, unless you have drugs that are going to just be knock your socks off, obvious to anyone that these, this kind of Lazarus effect. You have people getting up out of their wheelchair, people, it's just so obvious that the drug works, in which case you're not going to need the provisional approval. FDA would be willing to grant approval under its existing authority. So the reason that I'm so concerned about this is lowering the standard for approval. It sounds like not so bad, right? Patients understandably are willing to accept often, less certainty in favor of early access. But I worry about the kind of downstream effects. First of all, right, it could be very bad for patients who say, wait, actually, I would like to have some more data to figure out with my doctor whether this is something that I want to take. But what I worry about is the development of other drugs, right? So if you were to allow a product with provisional approval on the market where you have lots of uncertainty about whether it's in fact beneficial, it could be quite difficult to do further studies. Right? We've heard all the, the past couple of days about people not having time to wait. So you might be seeing patients say, all right, we will prefer to take this provisionally approved drug. We're not going to participate in trials of this drug. We're not going to participate in trials of another drug, right? Unless we can be, randomized to the new drug or this one. Okay, well then how are we going to study the next drug? We're going to compare it against this provisionally approved one that we're not sure works. And so you can see this kind of chain effect that actually it could inhibit the development of better drugs. And this is why I talk a lot about this tension between what's good for current patients and what future patients might need. And I think that's just a deep ethical challenge. Obviously, we need to care for patients who are living today, but that we don't want, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road to be in the same exact position with having drugs that are approved, but drugs that we don't know work. So that's the piece of legislation that really keeps me up at night because it won't go away. It keeps kind of rearing its head. I know there are people in the audience who are advocating staunchly in favor of this bill. It's really something that there are lots of views about, but that's my view. I'm quite concerned about it.
Karen?
Happy to chime in, and I agree with you. From North's perspective, we are worried about the Promising Pathways Act. I think, if anything, over the last 2 days, it's really reinforced the challenges with expanded access and the fact that the underlying challenge that Promising Pathways Act is trying to address is a challenge, that there are patients out there that could potentially benefit from investigational therapy that have currently challenges accessing them. From our perspectives, for fairly similar reasons to what Holly outlined, we're really worried about promising pathways being the right pathway. The first concern over the last 2 days, there's been so much debate about the importance of informed consent, of really working with the family and the physician to understand is this the right therapy to try? Getting the product provisionally approved would take a lot of that out. And we know that in particular for our patient populations, early clinical evidence oftentimes is not predictive of whether the drug actually works or not. And so cutting off the clinical development at that point, taking out the IRB, taking out all the things that we spent the last 2 days discussing, I think can be really detrimental for our patient community. We share the same concerns about the second drug coming to market. Putting my FDA hat on, the challenge of trying to develop that drug and trying to figure out how to write the statistical plan for that second drug that is provisionally, where the comparator might be the provisionally approved drug. There are lots of challenges there. But I think one of our biggest concerns really is on the payment and reimbursement side. We had a huge debate today about who should pay for expanded access programs. I see the same concern about provisionally approved drugs. I come from the FDA world. When I started at Nord, I thought bringing a product to market was a hard challenge. What I came to realize pretty quickly is coverage and reimbursement are so much bigger challenges for many in our community. So we are really worried that providing another pathway, one that has a lower bar, that can be easily confused with accelerated approval, can really undermine a lot of the challenges to coverage and reimbursement. So on the private payer side, we know many of our patients are already struggling to access therapies, in particular accelerated approval therapies, even though they've gone through a rigorous approval process. We think that it is quite unlikely that there will be robust insurance coverage for provisionally approved products on the private payer side. On the public payer side, right now, CMS has to cover any FDA-approved drug. And yes, we talked about some of the nuances of what that might mean. And we talked this morning about NCDs and CEDs. But by and large, an FDA-approved drug right now has to be covered. We think that creating a new pathway where we really don't know whether the product works or not really threatens to undermine this and really lends credence to really changing the paradigm and making it so much harder for many in our community to access FDA-approved therapies.
Well, Zach, what's your perspective on the perils of passing the Promising Pathways Act?
I guess I would say from my conversations with companies, I think anything to diminish the FDA gold standard in any way is a huge negative and a huge risk. I think that they are very much worried about. I think a lot of the companies looked at Right to Try and were scared away from it because they didn't want to get on the FDA's bad side, and they know that if they have a pipeline of drugs that they're going to have to take through the FDA, they don't want to go around the typical process in any way and run afoul in any way. Not that that would necessarily run them afoul, but I think they're very cautious. They're very risk averse in any way. And I think, the FDA has always been kind of the gold standard in international approvals. And that was another bill that I think we've seen floated in the Senate over the years is, this bill that will create reciprocal approvals. So if a drug is approved in, say Europe or Japan or some of the other stringent regulatory authorities, then, after a certain amount of time, it would then kind of become FDA approved. And, I think that's a much less chance of winning congressional passage than, say, the Promising Pathways Act. But at the same time, it's still out there. I think a lot of people are worried about kind of a race to the bottom. You see that the UK now has a reciprocal approval pathway, and some of the execs I've spoken to are a little bit concerned that companies are just going to go to the easiest regulator they can find, and then they'll have a UK approval. So we'll see. I don't think that's quite happened yet, but something to look out for.
What's your thoughts on the reciprocity issue, Holly?
It's another one of these proposals that I can understand the genesis of, right? Why should Americans have to wait longer than the rest of the world to access drugs, right? I mean, Americans don't ever want to be second, right?
Well, why can only the rich Americans get to fly to Saudi Arabia and get the drugs?
Yeah, so I mean, I do understand the impetus behind it, but it ignores the fact that FDA is first to approve the vast majority of drugs. And so my concern is that, and I just should put it out there, this is not something that I've studied extensively, so this is more of my off-the-cuff reaction. When FDA has not yet approved a drug that another regulator, that the other regulators have, I wonder, why not, right? Is it just that FDA is slower in that particular instance, or is it because there is some deeper concern? But I think this is not typically a problem, right? The FDA is approving drugs faster than the rest of the world in the vast majority of cases.
I might just flip the question on the head just a little bit. I think from our perspective, increased international harmonization through the ICH International Commission on Harmonization, through more of a real move towards global clinical trials is something that we wholeheartedly embrace, understanding that in the rare disease space, there's so few patients out there, and trying to really obviously, there are lots of challenges with international harmonization, with running global clinical trials, but I think moving towards greater harmonization and mutual recognition and streamlining the processes between the competent authorities, that is certainly something that we wholeheartedly agree. The specifics of reciprocity without, while cutting out the regulatory the competent authorities in the individual countries, that is concerning. We do think that FDA should have the final say of whether a product is approved in the US or not. And I agree with Holly, the data by and large shows that the vast majority of drugs are either first approved in the US or within a relatively short timeline of being approved in the EU or the UK. Understanding that there are some instances where maybe things could go better and where there's an opportunity to further streamline the process.
So any other dumb ideas in Congress that would be worth flagging, maybe quickly?
I can just follow up on something that Zach brought up earlier, and that is the bill around PREA, the exemption of orphan drugs from rare disease, from pediatric studies. I think from our perspective, as I said before, pediatric data is very important, and we want to create incentives for more research. The bill itself would actually increase funding for NIH to help close some of these data gaps and improve FDA's ability to enforce some of the pediatric study requirements, which are things that we're very supportive of. I think where we're a little bit concerned is as part of the bill, FDA will have to promulgate guidance on when the PREA requirements don't apply, and there can be partial or full waivers. For us, the concern is around the timing, because lifting the current exemption before having guidance in place and before really understanding the logistics of how things will operate in the new normal, understanding oftentimes the condition that would qualify a drug sponsor for a partial or full waiver are exactly the ones that we have in the rare disease space, hard to study diseases, small populations, etc. And so from our perspective, while we wholeheartedly support the intent, we have some remaining concerns around the timing.
Zach or Holly, I have other, you don't have to speak on this. I just want to open the floor.
It's not a specific piece of, proposed legislation, but I alluded to this before. It's just the broader idea that there is, if we don't have a cure for something, there's a legislative fix for it. And I think we talked about this before, the legislative fix could be money, but we should not fool ourselves into thinking that we can that Congress can cure diseases through kind of legislative change of regulatory standards. And so those are the kinds of things that there are some advocacy organizations that I think focus a lot of advocacy on legislative fixes, not just to funding, but to approval standards, and or I should say funding is great. Opportunities to streamline clinical trials, make them easier to run, make them easier for people to participate in through supporting decentralized trials. Like those are the sorts of things that I think work well in legislation. But when Congress tries to, frankly, I was going to say interfere, but that's a little bit too strong because they do oversee FDA. But when Congress fails to kind of respect FDA's expertise, right, and the kind of comprehensive regulatory system that they've been able to develop, I think that's where problems arise. And we can talk all about Chevron if you want now.
Well, I mean, that does open up the courts to interfering as well. And there's been some recent decisions coming out of Texas in particular that really add another leg to this stool. I'll ask a couple more questions, but in the last 16 minutes, I want to make sure that if, CUPA is a place for debate and divergent opinions as well, and especially on this topic. I want to make sure that anyone that has like a contra that wants to argue or disagree, I want to make sure you have the first chance at the mic to do so and feel welcome and encouraged. Please, Kathy, come on up. And anyone else? I just want to make sure we have the full range of perspectives. I think our panelists have done a great job of introducing, but I've really kind of pressed people to have an edge on their comments. So please.
So thank you. And Holly and I have been around and around in this before. So, and I am not a cheerleader for promising pathways, but I do think on behalf of some of my friends who aren't here, I would like to offer some other context to what was discussed. So ALS, we don't have a biomarker. So for diseases that don't have a biomarker, you look at accelerated approval and it's like, what can we do that gives you some of the advantages of accelerated approval and still does good science? So, and that's where this whole idea of a conditional pathway could be helpful. Now, I'm not sure the sausage, the way it's being built right now is right, but I think we need to keep working on that sausage to make sure the right things get into the path and we know how to get things out. To a person, every person I know who has been an informed advocate on promising pathways wants a good scientific confirmatory trial. They don't want to slide through. I mean, the registry data could certainly be helpful, and it could be certainly maybe help you tell you if this is a futility situation, we need to bail, or, it can give you ideas. But everybody I know who's been working hard, and Holly knows there's a group that's been working hard on this, they want a good scientific confirmatory trial. So I think if the sausage needs to be fixed, it needs to be fixed. But I think it's still being worked on. But I do think the idea of conditional approval, if it can be honed into something scientifically sound, that's not lowering the standard, but perhaps extending a period of viable access while things are being worked out is what people have in mind. So I don't think, I just want to make sure that people realize that there are some reasons why this could be helpful with some diseases that can't use accelerated approval. So thank you.
Please, Holly.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why this looks like a good fix, right? We have some diseases that accelerated approval is not functioning for. You at least need to have a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. A couple of things here. So one is FDA uses demonstrates a lot of regulatory flexibility, even outside the accelerated approval pathway as it is. And in that regard, right, one of the benefits of the promising pathway approach is at least this idea that there's going to be further data collected after the fact. So I know there's a lot of ALS, folks in the audience. So if you take Relivrio as an example, right? Here's a drug that got approved with traditional approval and a promise to keep studying it. Outside the accelerated approval pathway could create some problems, right? So so in that regard, the promising pathway model of having time-limited provisional approval is, better than what happened in that case. My concern is doubling down on the problems that we see in accelerated approval, where what we know is when a product gets marketing approval, it becomes very difficult to do rigorous confirmatory studies. And the reason for that is obvious, right? Why would I want to participate in a study in which I might be randomized not to get the approved intervention so that you can keep studying it? So then we have questions about, are our payers going to pay for it? Or do we just accept weaker evidence on the back end? And these are legitimate policy and ethical questions, right? Like these might be trade-offs that we decide as a community are reasonable trade-offs. I just want to acknowledge that there's no perfect fix where we can get the drugs really early and then be also totally confident that they are beneficial.
Understood, but to the point about the confirmatory trial, in ALS, EMA has wanted longer survival trials in ALS. So that's the model that we're even using, like like for Relyvrio, is do the shorter trial in the US, get it in Relyvrio, hit its primary endpoint. But if a longer trial is needed, that can be done in Europe. And that does away with some of the problem of who in
But
the US
also
is going
raises
to
lots of
volunteer.
ethical questions. Oh, we can't do it in the US, we'll go abroad.
Do the other trial in Europe, where EMA wants a longer trial with different endpoints. And if that succeeds, EMA can say, you can market in Europe. So I mean, I think that, but that's a situation in ALS that permits that confirmatory trial. Thank you.
I guess-
Professor Peter Pitts?
I guess two things. The first is relative to harmonization. You know, I'd much rather think about harmonization of data versus harmonization of regulatory decisions, because, you know, once you try to harmonize regulatory decisions, who's responsible when things go south or go bad? Data is a different story. I should live so long. You know, these ICH conversations are just, they're highly complicated. They're very political. And, you know, I personally, I'd like to focus on seeing data that's not currently being accepted by the FDA rethought. I think there's a lot of potential there. Relative to PPA, promising pathways, I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, you know, I know from my discussions with the FDA, their major complaint is, you know, we already have conditional approval. It's called accelerated approval. True, but not necessarily accurate relative to disease states that can't access accelerated approval. I think you have to look at all the various expedited pathways and view them as a Venn diagram. And to your point, you know, there are parts that are not colored in, and you know, the need is to focus in on those areas and be more specific. FDA will say, you know, we don't need it. And I would argue, I guess, to your point, that they do need it for certain disease states that are kind of left out in the cold at the moment. So, you know, I think it's harmful to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that need to be fixed.
So, do you want to have a question, please? Or comment?
Oh, no, I hate commenting when there's clear experts on the panel. Actually, two questions. One on the IRA. Thoughts on whether the multiple litigations are actually going to hold up the negotiations. I've been asked this myself and never really know where to come down.
The lawsuits I've seen are stupid.
That's no guarantee they're not going to succeed.
Yeah, yes.
Look, I mean, I'm not a payment expert, but the constitutional claims that have been raised in this context seem to be just an extraordinary stretch. For anyone who gets the Politico Pro emails, I get yours too, Zach, don't worry. But if you get these like newsletters, in the Politico emails, there's pharma, the industry trade group,
yes.
advertises, and so you just like kind of hit every day with these claims about the IRA, and you know that it's government price setting and that it's going to kill
Yes.
innovation and all of these things, and it's become such divorced from kind of the reality of the law, right? It's become this kind of caricature that the government is going to prevent industry from profits, full stop. And that's not at all the case, right? What the law says is that for these selected drugs that are incredibly costly to the government, there's going to be a negotiation over the fair price, not no profit, right?
Yeah,
The idea
yeah,
is
yeah.
not, to make these industries into nonprofit entities. And so I think it's just become really difficult to have a legitimate discussion about what the likely outcomes are going to be and what the trade-offs are. It might impact innovation. That doesn't mean that it's not a good law, right?
Yeah.
Because we already are having these huge challenges figuring out how are we going to pay for drugs. And
Yeah.
so we have to figure out that issue about what can the government afford to pay.
Yeah. So, sorry, I didn't actually even introduce myself. I'm Beth Roxland. I'm both a lawyer and a bioethicist, so usually not welcome in most rooms. Actually, sorry, it's been a long time since I looked at the IRA, but I think why some of the arguments seem so ludicrous, if I remember correctly, built into the law, is an immunity provision against lawsuits. And the only way to overcome that is to make constitutional claims. So they're bringing up arguments that don't seem as logical as, or almost as strong, like as, let's really look at, are we going to defeat innovation? But the only way to overcome whether the legislation could even be brought to court is to raise constitutional claims. And I think it's like unfair taxation
I mean,
or
there were
something
so
like
many
that.
claims
But
that-
anyway.
about the Affordable Care Act, right? There were so many claims that law professors said that is completely frivolous. And then the Supreme Court said, we think that's a good argument. Right? You know, you don't actually have to expand Medicaid, and you can't actually, I mean, all of these things that started out as wild claims
Yeah.
then got traction, right? So I'm not confident about what's going to happen with, the IRA lawsuits. I'm not confident about what's going to happen with the mifepristone lawsuits. I mean, there's lots of legally frivolous claims that get traction.
So unless Zach or Karen want to get in on those, I'll ask something else.
The only thing I can say from a practical standpoint, I think February 1st is the date that CMS has to provide the initial offers. So at least as of now, the
It
process
hasn't been
is
held up too much. I actually
moving
did have
forward.
one more question. Chris, feel free to veto me. Holly is now scared the hell out of me on the Promising Pathways Act as well, having lived through right to try, from what the very first state to, federal implementation. And a lot of some of the things you said, even lack of definitions. It sounds good. You get into the detail. There's a lot of worrisome things. Do you or any of you have ideas or understandings of the genesis of the law? Like as we started looking at right to try, it looked like a grassroots movement. Then became very clear it was a very well-funded, well-coordinated effort out of Goldwater and one other libertarian organization. Is that what we're dealing with here, or
No.
is this?
No, we should invite Kathy back up, or there are, or Sonia. I mean, it's. I'll just very briefly say it's not the same kind of think tank driven piece of legislation that right to try was. It's very much patient driven.
And at least on its face, it's a beautiful compromise. It says, let's get things onto the market faster, but then let's be harder. Like, let's be, quicker about getting them back off the market, and at least saying we're going to develop evidence afterwards. So it looks like a grand compromise on this.
Yes,
on the
so
surface.
sorry, Sonia with IMALS again. So it is grassroots driven. It's driven by people living with a disease that's always 100% fatal. And as Kathy pointed out, without having a biomarker, the accelerated approval process doesn't work for them. And so they're very frustrated because not only is science not working for them, but they're seeing the process being so time consuming. You die in the average of 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. So it is grassroots driven, and Kathy's correct. The bill is still being worked on. So they've taken, Senator Braun has taken the input he's gotten from the FDA and the TA and from the different communities. I know, well, I don't want to speak, but I know they met with some of the representatives of the rare patient organizations. And so they're trying to incorporate that all and make the bill tighter, stronger, and to address some of those issues. But yeah, this one is actually truly grassroots driven, which most
Yes.
aren't anymore.
Sorry, I
So
just
I don't
wanted
want
to
Bob
defend
Califf
you.
to be mad at me.
Oh,
So we need to keep it concise. Please ask it.
I'll be quick. Kuldip Dave from the ALS Association. Holly, actually what you're saying is already happening with the 3 drugs that are already approved and marketed. 4 actually, if you look at Qalsody for ALS. Companies are having a tough time when they're designing trials, whether you take people off of that standard of care. Some people are on 1, some people are on 2, some people are on 3, or some are on none. And so how do you design a trial? So that's happening now. It's not so I just supporting what you said. And on the flip side, on the access and payer side, we're again seeing that payers are not paying for, we just did a Medicare claim study where only 30% of people get Riluzole prescribed. And that drug has been available for 3 decades, just 30%. And we're literally having public spats with insurance companies on coverage for Relyvrio and Qalsody. And so where they're using fail first policies. And so if they're saying these drugs we won't pay for that got full approval because they have asterisks next to them, Relyvrio for phase 2 or Qalsody for accelerated, I just don't see a way how payers will pay for 3 or 4 drugs that will come out of the promising pathway.
I just want to flag that there is language in the bill that says insurers could not treat provisionally approved drugs differently than drugs that have other, are approved through other pathways.
Right.
Nonetheless, right, that doesn't mean that you must cover them.
Right.
Right? You could just
Right.
say, well, I don't care that it was provisionally approved. I wouldn't cover it if it got full approval. It doesn't
Right.
have enough evidence behind it. So
Exactly.
I see this attempt, right, to address that problem, but I don't think it will be a successful provision in the bill.
It's going to exaggerate it, in
It's
fact.
a radical change to American structure.
And there's so many obstacles with step therapy, prior authorization, coverage with evidence generation, and the list goes on and on and on. I think we all agree on what the problem is. I think what we're trying to do is find the right way of solving it in a way that ultimately works for our patients. And in our fragmented healthcare system, that is just really difficult.
So the powers tell me we have a little more time now. Zach, would you like to get into, we haven't been able to hear from you in the last several minutes. So anything you'd like to pick up?
No, I mean, I think it's been a really good discussion. I think on the harmonization point, the only thing that I would add is that we've heard Peter Marks say several times over the last few months that they're really trying to make an effort to harmonize the cell and gene therapy regulations across borders. And, he really wants to try and take some of these smaller rare disease populations and combine them with, other populations abroad and somehow leverage that data for more complete packages. So I think that is something that is going to be a lot more prevalent coming down the line. We heard the Wilson Bryan, the outgoing cell and gene therapy leader at the FDA, raise some concerns that there may be accelerated approvals where there won't be a confirmatory trial that can adequately address whether or not clinical benefit is met. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see how far the FDA is willing to bend in a lot of these scenarios. And I'm sure Dr. Califf will talk all about that.
I hope you did too. We'll thank our panelists and proceed.